Good evening. Welcome to Wednesday's class. On today is the 18th of October. We are in our 6 week, Tom? So we're getting along through the class pretty well. I'm going to start by sharing the a screen. I'm going to share the paint screen and I'm going to discuss with you, if I may, the um, uh, impedance formula. Now, I'm not sure how well this is going to work. I have not done this before using a stylus. But the letter for impedance is a Z. And that sure didn't show up. I need a color. Let's pick one. Nope. Well, so much for the drawing program. All right, let me use the mouse. The letter is Z, and still I get nothing. There we go. Z represents impedance. And the formula is pretty complicated. It's the square root of R, which is the resistance in ohms, plus X sub L squared. By the way, that's R squared. I'm not going to put parentheses around it. Plus X sub C squared. Gosh darn Nick. That's the formula. Keep in mind, X sub L and X sub C. I can't make that C to save my soul. They have their formulas. Oops, that's wrong. 2 pi F L and 1 over 2 pi F L. C, I'm sorry. Pi is the mathematical number 3.14, whatever. And F is the frequency. L is inductance in Henrys. And C is capacitance in farads. When you calculate this out, you get X sub L is going to be a value that's going to be in ohms, but it's ohms of uh, uh, of inductive reactance, and X sub C is going to be in ohms, and it's ohms of capacitive reactance. It sounds a little confusing, but it's not. What we're trying to do is make this all relate so that when we get done, Z is ohms of impedance. That's how we come up with the 50 ohms of a coax. Coax has is a conductor. It's got an outer shield and it's got an inner conductor. Now the inner conductor travels down the middle, should be centered. And the whole thing, the cable itself is Well, it's got components of itself that are inductive, and components of itself that are capacitive. If you imagine this center conductor as a set of two plates, because it kind of is, that wire traveling down the center of this shield, and this shield, I'm going to kind of color in a little bit. I'm drawing this like see-through. And we're going to take some value like this, go like this, pick a nice light gray. Now, if you can imagine that this shield, I color this in, this shield surrounds that wire. Well, essentially what you've got is that wire acts like a plate. So there's some capacitance between the shield and the conductor. All lengths of running wire have some inductance, not as great as if they were coiled up, but they have some conductance. Now, if you coil up a coaxial cable, you won't change its inductance very much because the shield kind of prevents that from occurring. But there is an inherent inductance and capacitance to its structure. And coax that we use for ham radio has been designed so that it has a 50 ohm inductance. And that's because our radios, because years ago, the US military decided to make a standard 50 ohm output. Our radios all follow internationally that same standard. But how is it all calculated out? Well, the resistance per inch or whatever per value inside this wire is minimal. The resistance per foot, whatever, at 100 feet or 200 feet, it has some minor effect. And eventually it starts adding up. But the resistance isn't the major factor. The major factor in all of this is right here, the reactance, the capacitive reactance and the inductive reactance. And that's because of the fact that the wire by itself is always going to be an inductor of some degree. And the distance between the shield and the center conductor acts just like a capacitor. A capacitor is just two plates. By definition, if you have a plate and off away from it, you have another plate. A capacitor is these two plates to be hooked to a wire and added to a circuit. If these two plates face each other and line up properly, depending on the distance between them and the size of the plates, the capacitors will have a greater or lesser capacitance. In fact, there is a capacitor which is really kind of cool and illustrates this. It's a type of variable capacitor, and I think I can do a drawing of what will actually look pretty cool to represent it. Imagine that you got a round plate, okay? And we make a second round plate in line with it. And now we take an insulated shaft. That's going to be my nemesis. We got an insulated shaft. And we thread that shaft through the center of both of those two plates. So that when we move or thread the shaft, the plates can move further apart or closer together. There is actually a type of variable capacitor designed just like this, so that the two discs will get moved closer and farther apart to vary the capacitance. But the capacitance itself, along with the frequency and the inductance of the wire, along with the frequency it's at, okay, will determine what the value of X sub L and X sub C are, the inductive reactance and capacitive reactance. Do not ask me why it's X sub L and not X sub I. I don't know, or X sub A. Why they picked L, I haven't got an answer for you. Some physicists did that. To not confuse you, just to stay with the coax. Obviously, as the frequency changes, you would think, well, the X sub C and X sub L change. Well, they do. But by design, when one goes up, the other one goes down. Remember, this is a 1/over formula here. And this one is a straightforward formula. And so when one rises, the other falls, and they stay the same ratio. So for coax, the length of coax does not change its impedance. What it does do, though, is it changes the quality factor of the capacitor and the inductor of the wire. The capacitance and the inductance of the wire has something called a Q factor. And that's the quality of how efficient it is. So as the frequency goes up, many, virtually all, coaxial cables become less and less effective. Okay? I wanted to review that and cover that so it would relate to something you would understand, and it would you could see the concept of the formula. So if you write this down in nicer handwriting, keep it handy. R squared plus X sub L squared plus X sub C squared, where X sub L is equal to 2 pi FL and X sub C is equal to 1/2 pi FC. You can understand the relationships. How often you'll ever have to do the calculations is virtually never. I will, though, at some point in the near future, bring this up again when we're dealing with antennas, because it's important for antennas. And we're going to start with question T2C10. And I've got to move a little thing that blocks my view. There we go. What information is contained in the preamble of a formal traffic message? Well, that's a little complicated. They give you a simple answer D. It says information needed to track the message. And that is what's in the preamble, but I think you should know all of it. There'll be a number that assigns the message number unique to that message. There'll be a precedence description. Now, all formal traffic, and these are like radiograms, are an example of formal traffic handled by traffic networks. In your book, there's a picture of a radiogram. The precedence defines what it says, the precedence of the message. Usually there are 4 types of messages for precedence, 4 precedences. One is, I'm going to start out of sequence with what they do it. First of all, the highest priority message, and the one that always takes precedence, is emergency traffic. Emergency traffic is life and death right now traffic. Below that, right below it, taking precedence, would be health and welfare. health and welfare is there was a hurricane this weekend, and it's a message going to somebody at the hurricane site. One of their family members wants to know if they're okay. That's not immediate life and death, but it's very high priority. It's higher priority than anything below it. The next level of message by priority is called priority message. Priority message is, well, after the hurricane, the relief organization is coordinating getting water to people to drink. It's not immediate life and death, or it could be, but then they would send it as emergency. But we're just making sure all the water is in the distribution centers. Okay, something like that. So you got a message that says, "Hey Tom, the water for your distribution center is on the way." Okay, that's not the same as Tom sending to the organization, "I've got people here dying of thirst and hunger. They need food and water right away." That's the more of an emergency. Okay. And the last but not least is routine messages. And routine messages, when they're generated and sent, they can be anything from "Hi, this is Uncle John. Hope you're doing great," to used to be a guy, I forgot where he was in the US. He passed away. There was a ham that every single ham in America, on your birthday, he would send you a happy birthday radiogram. And they get distributed coast to coast. He went through the call book, pulled up everybody's birthday, had a database made of his own, and he generated, that's all he did all day long, was send birthday wishes to every ham. Kind of miss him. He passed away years ago, but boy, I'll tell you something, that's a lot of work. Okay, the next piece of information in a official piece of traffic or radiogram would be handling instructions. If there are special instructions on how to handle or deliver the message, they would go there. Then would be listed the station of origin, which would be the call sign of the amateur station where the message was originated or generated. There would be a check, which is the number of words and word equivalents in the text, so that you can verify you've got all the words. Then there's the place of origin, usually a town and state where it was originated, and the date and time where it was originated. And then, of course, the address, street, city number, state, and oftentimes phone number, where the message is going. So it'd be a complete name there, address, street, everything. That's where it's being addressed to. With all that information and the message body, you've got a complete radiogram. What is meant by check in a radiogram? And the answer here is the number of words or words equivalent in the text, a portion in the text portion of the message. Now, what are word equivalents? Well, if you've got abbreviation groups in there that represent a word, they're not a word, but they're a word equivalent. If we said happy B-Day, B-Day is not really a word, but it's a word equivalent. If the message was, please contact me for a QSO on Thursday, QSO would be a word equivalent. Okay, things like that. All right, we're going to move on to radio wave and propagation. This is section 3. T3A1. Why do VHF signals strengths sometimes vary greatly when an antenna is only moved a few feet? And this is an interesting question because I'm going to read you all the answers. The signal path encounters different concentrations of water vapor. VHF ionospheric propagation is very sensitive to the path. Multi-path propagation cancels or reinforces a signal. Now, there's no answer shown on this page, but I'm going to give it a good guess. Wonder how I know that this guess is going to be right. The answer is C. And multi-path propagation is all that applies in this case, because this is a VHF signal. There is some types of skip for a VHF, but it's not ionospheric skip. And water vapor has very little to do with radio signals that are in a VHF spectrum. They can have effects in the microwave spectrum, but not in the VHF spectrum. So the answer is C. Radio signals arriving at the receiver are taking different paths. And that's because the radio signals can be both reflected and refracted. And they can also multipath through around, above, or between electromagnetic obstacles, things that are metal and block the path, or sufficiently large like metal to block the path. Let me unshare, and before we go to break, if I can't find it super quick, I'll go to break and I'll find it after the break. But I want to find a drawing I know I've got, and I know it's here. So the only question is where. Nope. Darn. I don't know where. I'll find it after. I'll find it during the break. So we'll take a break till 7 minutes after. And if you've got any questions, hit me with them, Jeff.
I'm good right now. I'm going to run upstairs real quick, tell my wife my son landed, so she'll know he's on the ground. And I will be right back.
That's a good, safe bit of news.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to go here. I'm going to go to C. If you're back, Jeff, do you want to start a little earlier or you want to take a little longer?
Were you talking to me, Nick? Sorry about that. I didn't have my earpiece in.
Are you ready to go or do you want to wait a little bit and take a little break?
It's up to you. I'm good if you are.
All right. I'm going to
He,
share.
he was on the phone with her by the time I got up there saying they'd landed.
Well, good for him. He knew to call mom, which is the right thing to do.
That's exactly how it worked.
You know, it's even the dog knew that. When I used to come home from work, the dog would look out, come out for whatever room he's in, see it was me and go, "Oh, it's you," and walk back wherever he was. My wife used to come home, he used to run out, his tail wagging, run up to her, sniff her, jump up to get petted.
Yeah,
And, I knew who was important at that point.
there you go.
All right. I got a little picture to show you here. And it's a great slide. It's part of a presentation you'll be seeing a little more in the future. But we're going to look at this part of it. This slide actually covers, or this little module I stole from a university uh, thesis that some grad student did, and it's done very well. It covers the different ways UHF and VHF signals travel. Now, there is some types of tropospheric scatter that reflect signals, but it's not that significant very often. And there is some hydrometeor scatter that's not caused by water vapor per se. It's caused from the breakup of a meteor when it enters the atmosphere. But we're going to ignore those for a minute till we get to that part. Radio signals can travel line of sight from point A to point B. They usually, as long as nothing's obstructing them, aren't affected by a movement of the antenna anyway, as long as there's a line of sight point A to point B. But if you walk between a big, say, door, metal door here, why that would have an effect. Another thing that happens is illustrated by this diffraction uh, illustration. Radio waves, just like light waves, can bend over sharp edges, corners. Now, what we call sharp doesn't have to be sharp like a knife blade sharp, but a reasonably sharp rather than rounded edge, like the edge of a building, the top of a mountain. And they can get refracted and bent down. When this occurs, you got a multipath situation that can occur. You can be standing right here where there's a direct path and a refractive path because you're right at that edge point. And refractions don't have to occur over the top of a mountain or building. They can be around the edge or corner. So as you're moving your antenna, like driving in a car, signals can fade in and fade out. When you're multipathing, you'll hear this in what we describe as picket fencing. It's as if you took a card, a playing card, and walked alongside a picket fence and you slapped it along in between the slots as you walked. And it went click, 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 click all the way across while you hear the signal in and out, in and out, in and out, as if it was coming between the slots of a picket fence. So we call it picket fencing. By the way, while we're discussing, there are other multipath conditions that occur in radio, and we're going to discuss them. One of them is ducting. Tropospheric ducting is caused because of a temperature inversion. Hot air and cold air, one go below the other. In other words, the hot air gets below the cold gets below the hot, and it forms a duct of differential air conditions. And that permits radio waves to bounce up and down in that ductwork and travel long distances. Now, I mean long. Some of them can be thousands of miles. I think the record is 17. No, I think it's like 56 or 67 or some. It's a long distance, 1,000 miles. Okay. I'll look it up for 2 meters and 440 if I remember. But you can actually Google that if you really want. Okay, I'm going to stop share. We're going to go back to the book, and we're going to go on with questions. What is the effect of vegetation on UHF and microwave signals? Well, as you get higher and higher in frequency, vegetation, a lot of people think, well, like trees and leaves, they're made of wood. They are. But in the trees and in the vegetation, in the plants, are saps and fluids. They can contain salt, just like your blood does, and they are conductors. So as the frequency gets higher and higher, leaves and uh, vegetation, they tend to absorb radio frequencies. They block the radio waves. um, it's not tremendous like on the VHF frequencies. It gets noticeable on the UHF frequencies. And when you get into the microwave frequencies, it can block everything. Just like rain and snow on UHF and VHF usually don't have much of an effect. But if it rains good and hard and you're on the microwave frequencies, well, I used to have a satellite TV system at home, and it was perfect for predicting the weather. If it rained or snowed, I couldn't get TV. And then I knew it was either raining or snowing. So, of course, my weather rock works better. I have a rock outside. If it's wet, if the rock is wet, it's raining. If it's got snow on it, it's snowing. If it's dry, it's sunny. If it's dark and you can't see it, it's nighttime. It's a real great weather rock. Anyways, what antenna polarization is normally used for long distance CW and single sideband contacts on VHF and UHF? And now I want to read all the answers because I want to discuss why and how and what they are. First two are right hand and left hand circular polarized antenna. We'll leave those for last. The last two are horizontal and vertical. Horizontal antennas are horizontal to the ground, and horizontal antennas generally work best for weak single signal, long range, and skip propagation. If you want to communicate station to station over a longer distance, horizontal antennas are the way to go as a rule. Vertical antennas, though, work much better. And the reason for that is because horizontal antennas can propagate the signals at angles that permit longer distance travel. Vertical antennas, though, are most efficient for direct point A to point B line of sight communications, such as operating through a repeater, because conceptually, a repeater is located in a position so high that it has line of sight for an incredible distance to radios all around it. And then even though each radio is at ground level or close to it, mobile or a handheld, it's the repeater's high location makes line of sight communications to each station possible. And since the repeater is repeating the signal, it works out really well. Now, left hand and right hand circular polarized antennas are predominantly used to communicate with satellites. It's because satellites spin. And when they spin, their antenna is either spinning left-handed or right-handed, which means either clockwise or counterclockwise. And we define right hand as clockwise, left hand as counterclockwise. And you want your signal to the satellite and your receiving of the satellite to also match its spin in polarization. You ain't going to match it in speed, trust me. But that isn't necessary. Well, so the answer to this question is C. Horizontal polarization is preferred for weak signal contact because it results in lower ground losses when the wave travels from or travels along the ground because of its angle to the ground. I am adding that so you understand. T3A04, what happens when antennas at opposite ends of the VHF or UHF line of sight radio links are not using the same polarization? Well, if you're vertical and the other guy's horizontal, you're going to get some loss of signal strength. And you can think of it this way. Let me do this by stopping the show, and I'm not going to draw this. I'm going to use my hands. You see my hands? Imagine I've got two horizontal antennas. All of the waves between my hands are lining up if they're both horizontal. But if one is vertical and the other is horizontal, then only a small amount is intersecting each other. So you're not getting effectively as much signal. I'm going back to share screen. I can't even draw that better than that illustration. It's probably the best way to illustrate that. And you get the best and signal strength, vertical, horizontal, except when you're using true skip. And that happens in the HF spectrum of the band. As technicians, you won't really have the opportunity to take advantage of much of it, although occasionally it happens in quite effectively on 6 meters, which is the lower part of VHF spectrum. When the signal skips off the ionosphere, sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes it comes back at an angle where it's not coming back horizontal or vertical. It's coming like 45 degrees out. Under those conditions, it doesn't matter. So, but as a rule, you want antennas to be the same orientation. Vertical, horizontal. So yes, we have different antenna orientations for different applications. T3A05, when using a directional antenna, how might your station be able to communicate with a distant repeater if buildings or obstructions are blocking the direct line of sight? Okay. The answer to this would be B. Try to find a path that reflects the signal to the repeater. It is not impossible to bounce off of a building. It's also possible, by the way, to find a path that refracts the signal to the repeater. And with a beam, you can change you can change the direction of most of the signal leaving that antenna. That's what a beam does. So we will, when we go through the theory on antennas coming up, we will discuss how beams do this. What is the meaning of the term picket fencing? I described it already to you, didn't I? Well, the answer is B, rapid flutter on mobile signals due to multipathing propagation. And I hope I gave you a good description of how it works. What weather condition might decrease the range at microwave frequency? I think I already discussed this already too. Participation, even fog, rain, snow, they can absorb microwave and higher UHF frequencies. They have very little effect on VHF and HF frequencies. So, in the 440, 430, 440 band, it's not all that much of a problem. On the 220-meter band, you don't get it at all. It doesn't really affect things at all, the moisture and rain. But I'll tell you, at 900 megahertz and 1.2 gig, well, I have a 1.2 gig mobile I was using for a little while to try a repeater out that got put up in Detroit. And it seemed like anything that blew by interfered with it. It seemed like every time a drop of rain fell, every time a leaf blew off a tree, you could literally see the signal drop out and drop back or come back in when it got out of the way. What is the likely cause of irregular fading signals propagated by the ionosphere? And the answer here is random combination of signals arriving via different paths. That's multipathing. Multipathing propagation, different signals come from different paths. And because some paths are sometimes longer than others, there can be, even though it's not perceptible to the human ear, it can arrive at slightly different times. And so you can get a little distortion. You may not realize that it's because there is the tiniest amount of delay in one signal over another, but it will give you that effect of fading and fading out as well. So it's because of multipath propagation that you get a random combination of signals arriving via different paths. One might be reflected around something, one might be bounced off something else, and one might be coming directly at you. Which of the following results in the fact that signals propagated by the ionosphere are elliptically polarized? This is what I tried to describe a little earlier. Either vertical or polarized antennas may be used for transmission or reception. B is the answer. Because when a signal bounces off the ionosphere, it really doesn't come back vertical. It really doesn't come back horizontal. We don't have antennas that can actually make this signal, but it actually comes back as what we refer to now as an elliptically polarized, or I like to think of it as being off-angle signal. It's somewhere in between horizontal and vertical. And down below in this book is a little description. It clarifies this: because as radio waves travel through the ionosphere, its polarization changes from vertical to horizontal to a combination of the two, both vertical and horizontal. And that's what we're referring to as elliptical. It's both vertical and horizontal when it comes back. So its components have been kind of split up. It's not that we lose a lot of power to this. Remember, whatever is bouncing back off a skip is never 100%. So what bounces back vertical and what bounces back horizontal does not detract from how much is skipping back. It just is the way it works. And some signal, even though you're skipping, is also traveling straight out into space. All righty. What does multipath propagation, what effect does multipath propagation have on data transmissions. Well, multipathing tends to create errors in digital communications because of the fluctuation. The answer here is the distortion caused by UHF and VHF digital signals being received with a higher error rate. It's because of the fluctuation caused by multipathing. The human ear does a better job than computers do at correcting for this. Early digital, like teletype, had to be so precision tuned in, and still does, by the way, because teletype doesn't have error correcting. Modern digital systems have a form of what we call a checksum, and things like packet radio will send the data. The other side will verify or not verify that the checksum number is correct, and that's a algorithm based number that's used to calculate what must be in the message. And if it's wrong, as in packet, the originating station will send it over again until the receiving station receives it correctly and verifies it. So while it fixes itself, it slows the rate of communications while it has to send, resend, and resend. Fortunately, packet is sent in small packages called packets, and it isn't so disturbingly slow that we necessarily notice it until it gets really bad with errors, really full with errors. Multipath propagation will distort and create errors. So the error rate increases. That necessitates retransmissions or corrections, which take time. So it also slows the communication. Which
So Nick,
region?
yeah. Does the retransmission, do you see it and you have to do it, or does it automatically do it until it gets it right?
In something like packet radio, it automatically does it in the background. You don't notice it. If you're listening to teletype, which has no correction, you got to send that back to me again, please. If it's Morse code, it will be distorted, but most ham radio operators can figure it out unless it's really terrible. As I said, the human ear is better than the machine in that case. But if you're trying to copy Morse code, even if it's computer to computer, and you're trying to copy it with a computer, it will not be able to decipher it unless it's closer than that. Okay. Which region of the atmosphere can refract or bend HF and UHF radio, or VHF, I'm sorry, radio waves? And that would be the ionosphere. The ionosphere is between 30 and 260 miles above the planet. The International Space Station is in the ionosphere. It's a very thin layer of atmosphere. Super thin. You can't breathe up there. You can't live up there without a spaceship or a spacesuit. But it can become charged and ionized from solar sunspot activity, which spits out towards the Earth particles. Those particles ionize, they put free ions, which means molecules, they either have too many electrons or not enough electrons. And until the laws of equalization occurs where everything tries to reach an equilibrium, eventually over time, those particles will absorb the missing electrons or give up the ones they don't need. Okay. But until they do, the ionized atmosphere will act like a reflector. And depending on how far down the atmosphere is ionized, that affects how high a frequency will bounce off the atmosphere. During the daytime, higher frequencies will bounce off, because on a real high solar activity time, when there's a lot of sunspots, it can be very close to the Earth. And so bands like 6 meters and even sometimes 2 meters will skip off the ionosphere. But at night, that there's no longer particles charging that this side of the planet, and the charge rapidly dissipates. It discharges. It's not being replenished by the sun, so the charge layer gets higher and higher. We're going to cover that when we cover this in probably in, I think, next week's lecture on Monday. So the ionosphere is the portion that handles this. And you know what? I do have a drawing I'd like to show you. What time is it? Yeah, let me do that before the break real quick. I'm going to go to my drawings, and I'm going to share with you a drawing. Share screen. We'll go to the drawings. And somewhere in this fine set of drawings of mine, I go to, okay, come on. Let's go back. Let's go to menu. Here we go. Here we go. And don't save that crap. That's crappy writing of mine. All right. This illustration is for illustration purposes only. I want you to realize it is a representation to visualize. Boy, it's taking the longest time. Can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay. During the daytime, I want you to imagine that we're looking at 30 miles up, and it shows you we're 100 miles up. The zero there is the bottom of the ionospheric level of the atmosphere. I think. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's supposed to be the Earth. Maybe the D level here is close to the bottom. Okay. During the daytime, we define that various levels of the ionosphere charge up. For reasons that have to do with physics, it doesn't charge up equally during the day everywhere. It actually forms different layers. So signals can bounce off the D layer and come back, and some will bounce off the E, but the E and D layer are so dense that at this point that the layers above don't allow signals effectively to get to them. So the very long wave frequencies in the HF bands don't skip well during the day. But at night, because the very top layer becomes one large F layer, very low frequencies like the AM broadcast band will skip. That's why you could be driving in your car in Texas and listening to a New York AM broadcast station, because it's way down at 200 meters, right at, what is it, 56 kilohertz to, or 560 kilohertz to around 160 or 1600 kilohertz, 1.6 megahertz. And those signals will bounce off this F layer, which is usually by then, late at night, the only ionized layer left. There can still be some ionization in the E layer, but not much. So during the day, this highly charged up D layer, when the solar activity is greatest. Now, solar activity is not always efficient enough and not always present. The sun goes through a sunspot cycle, roughly every 11 years. We're entering the middle of a great one, I hope, right now. So this will occur well right now, but about 6.5 years from now, it will be miserable and every ham will be crying. And uh, every 7 or so years, well, it's not quite, about every 5.5 years, I listened to hams who got used to a really good sunspot cycle. Suddenly start to cry, the bands are dead. Yes, and you're going to have to wait because we can't change the sun. But that's what we're talking about. That's what this illustration, the signals can bounce off of it because the reflector, um, the lower it is to the earth, the shorter the wavelengths that will bounce off of it. Longer wavelengths, there isn't enough room for them to bounce back. Okay. When it's way up high late at night, then the longer wavelengths can have the room to bounce back and return to Earth. It's not that they might not be skipping off of it, but it doesn't do us any good if this signal comes up here like this and it bounces back down like this, missing the Earth. Then we wouldn't even know, or nor would we be able to hear it. If we hear somebody when this occurs, ask them what planet they're from, because that's the only way it would be possible. It'd have to be an alien, which gets me back to why there's no such thing as aliens, because we hams would have already talked to them. Believe me. All right. So let's go back to the book.
Maybe you have, and they just didn't tell you that's who they were.
Well, I imagine it's possible. I'm not going to say that it's impossible, but by now we'd have had a award for worked all aliens. We hams have too great an ego to pass that up. What is the effect of fog and rain on signals in the 10-meter and 6-meter band? And there's virtually no effect on the lower VHF, and there's really hardly any effect on the upper VHF. It's not until you get to the UHF and above frequencies where fog and rain have an effect. And the microwaves, you notice it greatly. In the upper microwaves, it is traumatic. All right. Magnetic wave principles, T3B01. What is the relationship between electric and magnetic fields in an electromagnetic wave? First of all, whenever an electrical current travels through a conductor, it creates a magnetic field spinning around it. It does so in what we call the right-hand rule. If you look at the wire that you've got electricity traveling through, if it's DC electrical, then the magnetic wave, you can calculate which direction around the wire it's spinning by pointing your thumb towards the positive side the wire is connected to. And wherever your fingers wrap around it, that's how the magnetic field is spinning around the wave. So can you see that when I show you this? Okay. Yes. So if my hand here is the positive side, and the wave, I put my hand with my thumb pointing along towards the positive side, the natural curl of my fingers is the direction of the waves around the wire. If it's an AC signal, it's doing this, then it's doing this, then it's doing this, then it's doing this. And that's what makes radio possible. the swinging back and forth or the shifting from the magnetic wave from one direction to another is effectively introducing motion. Whenever you have motion, a magnetic motion around a wire, when the magnets move by a wire, you will move the electrons in the wire. If a magnetic field is wrapping back and forth, you will move electrons back and forth through that wire. And that's how a radio wave works. The transmitter is hooked to the antenna, which is like one side of a transformer. On the other side is the receiving antenna. The radio waves are wrapped around it, and they're going back and forth as if they're creating motion. They're creating electromagnetic motion, and that motion forces the electrons to move forward, back, up, down. Got it? So let's get to the question. The answer here is the question here is electromagnetic waves wave properties. What is the relationship between electromagnetic waves, or I'm sorry, the electric and magnetic fields of an electromagnetic wave? Well, the electric field and the magnetic fields, they are right angles to each other. They always be at right angles. Even though this is spinning around, the wire is round, so it's always at right angles to this wire. Okay? What properties of radio wave defines polarization? And polarization is the orientation of the wave. Is the wave going this way? Is it going this way? Okay? Effectively, the major lobe of the wave, and we're going to cover that in the next couple of weeks, but the answer here is A. Polarization refers to the orientation of the wave's electromagnetic field. What are the two components of a radio wave? And the answer here is a radio wave is an electromagnetic wave. It has electric and magnetic fields. The part that travels through space cannot be the electric field. The electric field is in the wire that generates a magnetic field. But at the other side, the magnetic field regenerates the electric field. So you have present both in the transmission and in the reception an electromagnetic field that has electric waves and electric fields and magnetic fields. They compose the electromagnetic wave. The reason the electric component doesn't travel through space is because electrons have mass and they have weight, they have volume. It's tiny, but it exists. Radio waves travel at the speed of light. Magnetic fields are just the motion of the energy. And when it arrives at the other end, it instantly creates the electric field there at that end, at the other side. So we define the electromagnetic wave as traveling at the speed of light. And it's because your signal gets there at the speed of light. You can observe this if you ever bounce a signal off a moon. The moon is, I think, 250,000 miles from Earth. It takes light of something like, I don't know, 7/10 of a second to get there. And if you bounce a signal off the moon, you can actually hear your own voice coming back. I think it's actually a 7/10 of a second there and back. So you hear a little bit of an echo of your own voice. And that's because of the time it takes for the wave to get there and get back. So, what is the velocity of a radio wave traveling through free space? I've already kind of told you that. A radio wave is defined as traveling the speed of light. And it effectively does. All radio waves travel at the speed of light. And the lowercase c represents the speed of light. So, what is the relationship between wavelength and frequency? Well, the answer here is B. The wavelength gets shorter as the frequency increases. But I think you want to look at this equation right here. Okay. Oh, come on. Here we go. Right here. Right here. Lambda, which is the Greek letter L, is equal to the speed of light divided by the frequency. C is the speed of light. The speed of light in meters happens to be 300 300,000 meters per second. So if you want to determine a wavelength in meters of a at a given frequency, well, that formula right there is the answer: 300 by the divided by the frequency, and it will tell you how many meters. So if you divided, I'm going to use the number 150. If you divided 150 into 300, you're going to get 2. And our 2-meter band goes from 144 to 148 megahertz, which is pretty close to 150. So when we say it's a 2-meter band, it's roughly 2 meters. Now, if you want to calculate a resonant wavelength antenna for 2 meters, well, it's actually going to be whatever frequency you want to operate at divided into 300. If you want to calculate a half-wave antenna in feet, you replace that number 300 with the number 468. If you divide 468 by the frequency, it will give you a half wavelength dimension for making something like a dipole antenna. Now, if you know what the half wavelength is, you cut that length of wire, then chop it evenly in half in the middle, and you hook up both sides of the coax to it, and you got yourself an antenna at the frequency that you've designed it for. What is the relationship between wavelength? We already just covered this. It didn't give me a new screen. Here we go. And it's showing you this really cool drawing. This drawing, I can appreciate it, but well, let's see if I can enlarge it. There it is. This drawing is showing you that the reason this is so is because we define a wavelength to be from where the wave starts till it gets back to the same spot once again. It goes to a peak positive, a peak negative, and back to where it started from. That distance from a peak minimum to peak minimum, or from peak positive, or middle to middle, but where it's one complete wave from I like to define this a little different than this. How much time we got? A minute. Let me take you to a drawing that I'm going to do for you super quick. Okay. Let me stop this share. This will make it easier. I don't know that theirs is easy to understand. We'll go back to the decent drawing, and I'm going to eliminate it. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be as nice as they were. They have a prettier drawing than me. So, as we usually graph things in this world, I keep getting a screen that keeps jumping up in front of me. Anyways, I'm going to start with a thin little line. This one's a little thick. We'll make that line our 0 point. This line is supposed to be a straight line and represent 0. I don't know if I can correct it or not. It's close enough. No, it's not. Sometimes these things just don't cooperate. See if we can get a straight line across. That's close enough. That one's close enough. So if that line is 0, and I have a wave, a properly defined one wavelength is going to be from 0 to maximum value, through 0 again, to minimum value, and back to 0. This is one wavelength. And it's one wave itself. The wavelength is how long it takes for this wave to travel from positive maximum to positive, starting from 0 to positive maximum to negative maximum and back to 0 again. Since it's traveling at the speed of light, it's how far it will get based on the frequency. If the frequency is really fast, this wave is going to be much shorter. Now I'm going to do some compression. Might be equal in amplitude, but it's going to be shorter. So if this line here is time, which is what it is, you can see that it takes a lot less time for this shorter wave than it does for the longer wave. So wavelength is how far the wave travels at the speed of light. By the way, wave theory applies to all waves, even waves in the ocean. They just travel slower. You can't use the speed of light to calculate them. And they have wavelengths too. But sound waves do not travel the speed of light. You have to use the speed of sound to calculate wavelengths at the speed of sound. But electrical waves reproducing sound travel the speed of light. So, electromagnetic waves. Is this clear to understand? All right, let's go back to the
extremely clear.
Let's go back to the book for a moment before we go to break. Here we go. So that's what this is trying to illustrate with this drawing, that it's how far light travels, the distance that it will get across. And that's why the formula pertains to the speed of light and so on. It's also what you'll use to calculate and design your own antennas, because they're traveling along the antenna at speed of light at whatever frequency you're operating at. Okay. I want to close that. There we go. T3B06. What is the formula for converting frequency to approximate wavelength in meters? I think we already got to this, but the wavelength in meters equals 300 divided by the frequency in megahertz. The reason that works is a megahertz is in 100,000s. and the speed of light is 300,000 meters per second. And it works well. And since we usually work in megahertz for AM radio stuff and frequencies, it works out handy as heck. In addition to frequency, which of the following is used to identify amateur radio bands? Well, we identify them by their approximate wavelength in meters. So we refer to one of our longest bands as 160 meters, which is around 1800 kilohertz, or 1.8 megahertz. And if we divided 1.8 megahertz into 300, we'd come, well, 1.8 is close to 2. 2 into 3 would be 150. So it does come to 160 meters roughly. The 80-meter band is roughly a 3.5 to 4 megahertz band. If we divide 4 into 300, we get pretty close to 80. Not quite. As I said, they're approximate. There's some frequency in there that probably hits it right on the number, but we give it we work these blocks by definition to make it easier on ourselves. It's confusing at first to think about, but when you think about it, wavelengths are telling us how far that wave travels in one cycle. And one cycle is going to be frequency based. Remember, a cycle is per second. So 144 megahertz wave is going to be traveling back and forth, and it's going to create a wave way faster than a 100 or 1.8 kilohertz wave down at the 160 meter band. So, okay, this chart is something we want to pay attention to. I'll get to it in a minute, but if the question here is, what is the frequency wave or range for VHF? What frequency range is referred to as VHF? And VHF is above 30 megahertz and below or 300 megahertz. So there's a little chart in your book. It's the same chart that I'm showing you here. And it shows you VHF sits between 30 and 300 megahertz. UHF goes from between 300 and megahertz and 3 gigahertz. Super high frequencies go between 3 gigahertz and 30 gigahertz. Well, I'm going to go down the other end of the spectrum because we do have ham frequencies down here. At the very low frequencies, between 3 kilohertz and 30 kilohertz is the very low. The low frequencies are between 30 kilohertz and 300. We only have one ham band there. It's 160 meters. The AM broadcast band is down there too. Okay. I'm sorry, I stand corrected. I was thinking of the medium frequency. Low frequency, we do have one ham band. And we have one and a very low frequency band. We only have one band in the medium frequencies. That's right in between the HF spectrum and the AM broadcast band. Right in between here is our 160 meter band. HF is referred to as high frequency, and the reason is when radio started, that's as high as they could create. The technology didn't permit making anything higher. And so ham radio operators were told we could have everything above it. We actually were first given everything above 200 meters because they didn't know how to generate anything higher than that. Now, as they learned, as we hams discovered ways to use the frequencies, we kind of lost them. It's a natural progression because we're the experimenters of the radio world. We were kind of expected to lead the way and find out how to use these things. And so we were left pieces so that other services could go in between. And so this chart is useful to see where the HF band begins around 3 megahertz, which is an 80-meter band, ends around 30, which is our 10-meter band. The VHF band starts at 30 and goes to 300, and that's roughly includes 6 meters, 2 meters, and our I forgot what it is in meters, the 220 megahertz band. That's in that region. The 440 or 23 centimeters band, all the way up to 3 gigahertz. That's where the UHF or ultra high frequencies are. Today, satellites and communication systems and ham bands are available in the super high frequencies and in the extra high frequencies. And there are frequencies above 300 gigs that we hams have for experimental purposes. Finding radios for them going to be tough. Building equipment for is even tougher. If this chart expanded high enough, you get to the point where the electromagnetic waves become light. Light is an electromagnetic wave, just like radio. And we have a sensory organ called eyes that can see that part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, light is not actually measured in hertz because light, the frequency is so high. We redefined the frequencies there and measure them in something called angstroms, which is billions and trillions of hertz. Too big a numbers to play with, so they started over with angstroms to make it easier. Okay, what is the frequency referred to in UHF? And I told you already, it's above 300 megahertz, and it goes up to 3 gigahertz, which is 3,000 megahertz. Remember, 1,000 kilos is a meg, 1,000 megs is a gig, 1,000 gigs is a tera, and then an ultra, and it keeps going. But when the numbers, like I say, get really, really big, way outside of what is practically radio, and now it's like they shift in new set of numbers with angstroms to make the calculations easier. What is the frequency range referred to as HF? HF is from 3 megahertz to 30 megahertz. And in your book is this chart. Let's see if I can get it to enlarge. Maybe not. But this chart is in your book. And it is the same as the other one. It's just written differently. From the very low frequencies to extremely high frequency. What is the approximate velocity of a radio wave in free space? Radio waves, as we said before, travel the speed of light. And the speed of light is 300 million meters per second. That's pretty fast. Let's put things in perspective, okay? Let's look at how big the universe is, and I'll explain this. It takes light, which travels the speed of light, 8 minutes to get from the sun to here. The sun is the closest star to us. The sun is 8 times 3 or 2.4 billion miles, or sorry, trillion miles away. Roughly, right? Does that sound right? No, actually, I know the sun is 6 trillion miles away. But it takes about 7 or 8 minutes for light to get from the Earth to the sun. So maybe that's not an exact number. 6 trillion miles to the sun. Now, if you were to accelerate to that speed instead of your radio wave, you wouldn't get a bloody nose from the speed. You know how when you're sitting in a car and it speeds up, you sink back in your seat? Well, if you went from 0 to the speed of light, let's take a week to get there. You would, by the time you hit the speed of light, you'd already be flatter than a pancake. You'd probably be thinner than a piece of paper. The G forces would kill you instantly. That gives you an eyeball or an estimate of how fast these things travel and how far space. All right. Well, talking about the propagation modes, uh, predominantly for UHF, VHF radio. Why are simplex UHF signals rarely heard beyond the radio horizons? Well, the answer is C. Generally, UHF and VHF signals, they pass through the ionosphere and are lost out into space. They don't, as a rule, long distance skip off the ionosphere until the ionosphere is extremely highly charged, and that rarely occurs. But it does, but it's very, very rare. So usually we think of UHF and VHF frequency as being line of sight, although that's not entirely true. In engineering school, I was taught that VHF and UHF radio signals only travel directly in a direct path, and they never bounce off anything. As a ham radio operator, I already knew that wasn't true. I also knew that they can bend from refraction, they can be reflected. And I knew that what was being taught in engineering school was 75-year-old out of date uh, theory. And it was because there was very little market for understanding propagation for engineers. We don't really have to do that. We don't take advantage of it much or anything. But ham radio operators, we do. And I knew that hams have skipped a lot farther than one could imagine. In this chart, this drawing, okay, it shows you that um, signals bouncing off the ionosphere, and I kind of illustrated this before, that drawing I showed you. Well, UHF and VHF frequencies, their angle is never going to bounce back right unless it hits something way down close. And the charge doesn't get that close, because if it did, it would kill us. That ionosphere is part of our force field that protects us from the particles of the sun. So we don't want to curse at the fact that VHF signals and UHF signals, they don't bounce back, because we don't want them to, for our own sake. But there are other atmospheric conditions we're going to cover in the next few days, and we're going to discuss them, where we can skip UHF and VHF signals. What is the characteristic of HF communications compared with communications on VHF at higher frequencies? And the answer here is C. Long distance ionospheric propagation is far more common on HF. The lowest VHF frequency, and the one that technicians have full access to, is 6 meters. We call 6 meters the magic band because 6 meters sometimes behaves just like an HF frequency. It skips off the ionosphere when it's extremely well charged, and it bounces multiple hops and can travel around the world. And then sometimes you couldn't get 6 meters to bounce off of anything. That's why we call it the magic band, because sometimes it just works like magic and poof, abracadabra, it's gone. It doesn't do it anymore. The answer here is C, by the way. What is the characteristics of VHF signals received via aurora backscatter? Auroric backscatter is the northern lights. The northern lights are caused by a charged layer of the atmosphere at the poles. And it's not constant. It fluctuates. You can see it fluctuate. If you've ever seen the northern lights, they glow, but they oscillate in the way that they glow. And you can bounce signals off them. But because of that fluctuation, that constantly changing flux of the ionized layer that form up at the poles there, they distort the radio signal being bounced off of them. So the answer here is B. They're distorted and the signal strength varies because the reflector varies. It fluctuates. And I can't really describe that better, but that is exactly what's going on. So you can bounce a signal off of the northern lights, or if you're in the southern hemisphere, the southern lights, the aurora borealis or the aurora, whatever the southern one's called. You bounce it off the auroras when they're there, when the sun throws enough particles to create them. They will be distorted. Generally, they will not support digital communications. They'll support CW real easy. And they can sometimes be too distorted for phone, but it does work. You know. Which of the following types of propagation is most commonly associated with occasional strong signals on the 10, 6, and 2 meter bands from beyond the radio horizon? And that one is sporadic E. Occasionally the E level becomes ionized if sufficiently to reflect VHF and UHF signals back to Earth. It's called sporadic because it comes and goes. It's not necessarily an all-day affair. Sometimes it holds for hours and sometimes for minutes. It's kind of fun when you encounter it, though. Which of the following effects may allow radio signals to travel beyond obstructions between the transmitting and receiving stations? And of all the answers there, the first one, knife edge refraction, is the answer. Knife edge refraction refers to a hard edge bending the radio wave. If you've ever observed light waves bending over the edge of a surface, that is the same thing. If you make a dot in a piece of cardboard and you punch a pin through it, and you block off all the light around you except what comes in that little tiny hole, and your eyes get used to it, that little hole will bring light in from outside, refract it, and it can bounce on or be projected onto, well, it can be projected onto a back wall or something, and that is the makings of something called a camera obscura. The camera obscura is a Latin word or set of Latin words that means camera, which means room, and obscura, which means dark. The ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks learned that they could build a building on the top of a hill. They could put a hole in one tiny little pinhole in one wall, and if the far wall was white, light would shine in, and you could see what was down below from the top looking down the hill on the wall behind you, but it would be upside down and inverted. They use that to learn to draw in 3 dimensions. And when the camera obscura was invented, mankind started to learn how to draw in perspectives. It took a couple thousand years to come up with something called film to actually record the image. But originally it was a great drawing device. Eventually they figured out how to use mirrors and to reflect it onto a screen underneath a table, so that you could sit at the table with a piece of paper and trace the drawing, and then of course flip it upside down and turn it around, and you had the image you were recording or drawing. Radio waves will bend around an edge just like that. It is the bending around the edge, a hard edge, a sharp edge, is referred to by the word refraction. And that's why we call it knife edge refraction. A relatively hard edge, like a knife type edge, but doesn't have to be knife sharp type thing, can bend radio waves, like the side of a building, the top of a building, so on. And so that is why the answer here is A, knife edge refraction. We're going to cover that in a lecture coming up. There's a drawing here illustrating that. And it shows the knife edge and a radio wave coming across. And the radio wave will bend at that edge at multiple patterns or intervals. Some of it will bend back to Earth, some of it will miss the Earth, because refraction is an interesting phenomenon. There is a physics and a math to predicting all of this. We don't really deal with it. But it's important to note that when a signal is reflected over an edge, in this reflection right here, there are shadows or areas in between where it doesn't make it. So somebody here might get signal, somebody there might get signal, a guy standing in the middle doesn't. If you're walking between them, they're going to go in and out. And after you get past the furthest one that hits the earth, it's gone. You're not going to get it. Okay? Because the building or whatever is in the way. What is the type of propagation responsible for allowing over the horizon VHF and UHF communications to ranges of approximately 300 miles on a regular basis? And this is a unique one, and you're going to love this one. It's called tropospheric ducting. This is when a hot air and cold air inversion occur, and a trapped region of hot or cold air is caught between 2 layers of the opposite. A hot layer is in between 2 layers of cold air, or a cold layer is trapped between 2 layers of hot air. And they become, up in the troposphere, another layer of the atmosphere, they become like a duct. When a radio wave gets in them, it just bounces from the top and the bottom and the top and the bottom until it gets to the end and comes back out. So I think there's a drawing. No, there isn't. So we're going to do one. So we're going to end with this. I'm going to go to the drawing page, and this is going to be where we're going to stop this time. Okay, I'm going to share screens, go back to my weird bass drawings. And I'm going to clear the screen. And I'm going to make this drawing very easy. I'm going to draw myself a box to represent a duct. Now, because it's a duct, it's not going to have this edge. It's not going to have this edge. But a pocket of cold air, let's say that it's cold up here. So I'm going to put a big, well, no, I'm not. I'm going to put a big, this is cold air. Okay. And this down here is cold air. But this air up in here, oops, my efforts to indicate that this is warm air right trapped in a pocket. Now, if your radio signal comes in here, and I need a fine pencil to do this. There we go. And here comes your radio signal. And it hits this. It bounces back down. Then it hits this. Then it bounces back up. Then it bounces back down. Then it bounces back up. And now it bounces back down. And right over here, fortunately for all of us, is somebody else's antenna. And we're going to assume that to start this whole thing, we had an antenna over here. We can be hundreds of miles apart, hundreds of miles, and talk to each other because this duct in the troposphere allowed the signal to bounce back and forth through the duct because it couldn't get out until it gets to the end of the path. And these can be hundreds of miles long. I've observed them most in the early morning. I used to come home from work in the early morning, and on the frequency that the local repeater I like to work on was on. There's a repeater down in Florida. And every morning I used to work the guys down in Florida on the Florida repeater by changing my PL. We'll discuss that more in class. And I would raise their computer and talk to them because I would hear them. That means that the duct is open between them and me. And I would talk to them, they would talk to me. And as a rule, ducting occurs around average 300 miles. On rare occasions, like that one, it's even further. I learned that this repeater that I was talking about is somewhere in northern Florida. And I got to meet the guys down there. And we had several QSOs. But as I would go home and the conditions of the atmosphere would change because this inversion happens most often when the change of night to day occurs, day to night. Well, it would fade out real quick and be gone. So it was a time of day about 6 in the morning on my way home, and can't remember whether it was summer or winter, but I almost for a couple of weeks I could count on this every day. Then after I got done talking to guys in Florida, I would change the PL tone on my radio. Did I cover PL tones in this class, Jeff?
I recognize the term, so I think we probably
See,
discussed it, but I'm
the
not sure
correct
how.
term is CTSS tones. Okay. To activate repeaters and to prevent interference, we use a tone squelch system for a lot of repeaters. Now I'm talking about the CTCSS tone squelch system. In my state of Michigan, in this area, we use 100 hertz tone. You don't hear it when we're talking on a repeater, but when a repeater hears that tone on a signal, it desquelches and repeats the signal. If a repeater is set up for the tones desquelch, it will not retransmit a signal that doesn't have the right tone. And that way, signals intended for one repeater won't bring up another one from conditions just like this, unless, of course, the ham involved knows how to defeat it. And I just described that.